And so I think everybody has to draw the line in a different place, depending on who they are and what their priorities are, and also depending on where they are in their vegan journey and just how important it is to them to take that stand and to make that point.
As a vegan, do you ever feel like you're living in a parallel universe, aware of things that many others don't even seem to notice, let alone acknowledge? I'm Chrissy Benson, host of the Vegan Posse Podcast. We talk with vegans from around the globe who, like you, are living lives of integrity and compassion with an eye toward justice. Through their personal stories, you'll come to see that you're not an outlier. In fact, you're part of an entire posse of individuals who aren't just keeping the peace, they're creating it through their food choices and beyond. You won't be saddling up, but you're in for the ride of your life. Welcome to the Vegan Posse.
Hey Posse, I'm Chrissy Benson, host of the Vegan Posse. I'm recording this the day before Thanksgiving, which can be an interesting time for people who care about turkeys, birds, and animals in general. For that reason, we're bringing you this month's Posse Talk a little early to offer you a Thanksgiving Day boost. I'm fortunate to be celebrating Thanksgiving with my vegan brother and sister-in-law. As my brother noted, why do we even need to call it a vegan Thanksgiving? It's Thanksgiving with delicious actual food that's not the product of torture and suffering. Really, it's the omnivores who should feel obligated to clarify that their holidays incorporate speciesism, cruelty, death, and lots of willful ignorance. So in that spirit, happy Thanksgiving and enjoy this episode of Posse Talk with Jen Howk.
Welcome to this month's Posse Talk with Jen Howk. Jen, great to see you as always. I see you're calling in from West Virginia.
Yes, West Virginia represent today. So I'm
nice.
over here hanging out with Princess today. So
excellent.
Yeah.
Well, we are coming up on the holidays. And so that is a subject that is always helpful for people to hear about, just suggestions on navigating it. And a theme that's been coming up for me and a lot of the people that I've been talking to, or that I'm hearing from a lot of people that I'm talking to, which has made me reflect a lot too, is just, as always, how to deal with the people around us who are eating animal products and how accommodating or not accommodating should we be? Do we owe it to ourselves to be? Do we owe it to the animals to be? You know, we hear all these messages, and I'm hearing this a lot. Pushing doesn't work. Trying to control people doesn't work. Yes, fair enough. We can all stipulate to that. We know that intellectually. And at the same time, if we're going to budge the needle whatsoever in favor of the vegan cause for the sake of all the non-human animals in our world, and particularly in our so-called food system, nothing's going to happen if we say nothing. Or maybe it will happen if we do nothing. Maybe that is the only way. But yeah, just curious. Yeah, that's a starting point, at least. How has your own personal evolution been with regard to just, dealing with the omnivores?
I think it was pretty typical where when there's no zealot like a convert, so they say. So when I first found veganism, which I considered to be pretty late, I was into my 30s, and I'd been vegetarian for a long time, but I felt, I guess it was in my late 20s, and I had been toying around with it for a long time and sort of surrounded by people who thought, well, vegetarianism is fine, but veganism, that's just too extreme. So the whole battle over the meat in the center of the table, I felt like I had fought that a long time ago. And that was old hat by the time I came around to veganism. So it was just, I tolerated people eating whatever they wanted to eat. I'd been doing that for years, and it just kind of busied myself with the sides and tried to bring delicious things to share. And that was fine. That was a fine equilibrium. But of course, veganism sort of changes your perspective on things. There's a difference between being vegetarian and being vegan as far as your relationship to what other people are consuming and how you feel about that, and the participation in the whole system that is happening around the dinner table. So I went through a phase early on in veganism where I was pretty evangelistic. I was pretty pushy. I'd show up with the tofurkey and tofurkey used to, I don't know if they do this anymore, but they even made like a little kit that you could make the loaf look like a turkey, so you could pin on little wings and a little head.
Oh, I
um,
haven't seen that version.
it's
Wow,
not very
that's weird.
realistic. It's very
That's kind of
cartoonish,
creepy.
but yeah, a
Yeah.
little
Okay.
creepy. And I got just so much pushback. I was trying to go to these omnivorous dinners, these mostly family dinners that had tolerated my vegetarianism as, oh, she's just doing her thing. She's been doing that to some degree since she was a kid, so we're okay with that. Where now it's really much more of a philosophical difference. I am sitting in judgment of a broader ethical dilemma than I had been before with just the vegetarianism. And I just found that the conflict, it was not worth it. The juice was not worth the squeeze, as they say. I found pretty quickly that I did not want to be at omnivorous gatherings. It just was not a good trade-off of my time and energy for me. So I started to either not go or plan, a vegan or at the very least a vegetarian kind of Thanksgiving or Christmas or holiday dinner, whatever it was, that was predominantly vegan, and, hope to win over the lingering vegetarians, the stragglers who came along. But yeah, over the course of probably 5 years or so, I just got to a point where I didn't want to fight about it anymore. I didn't want to be that guy. I didn't want to be the one who everyone was singling out as freakish and weird and having some sort of unusual commitment to things that didn't make sense to them. I didn't like being on the defensive all the time. And it would have been one thing if I felt, as you kind of indicated in the introduction there, if I felt that it would have done any good, if it would have changed any minds, if I could have actually, however much I may not have wanted to be in that position, if being in that position of holding the line and educating people really would have made a difference that was discernible to me, I think I would have felt differently about it. But I knew that these people were never going to change their dietary habits. So I found that frontier with the vegetarians that I thought maybe I could nudge a little bit, and everyone else was just like, I'll see you. I'll see you at another event. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to come to your house. I'm certainly not going to have an omnivorous dinner at my house. And so I think everybody has to draw the line in a different place, depending on who they are and what their priorities are, and also depending on where they are in their vegan journey and just how important it is to them to take that stand and to make that point. And I've just been all over the map on that and played every role under the sun, and have found at this point I just keep my own counsel and tend to surround myself with people who get it.
Yeah. So what do you do for the holidays?
It depends on the year. So usually it's a very small gathering with friends. I live pretty far from family at this point, so I have not in many years made the trek back to, certainly not to Alaska, but even back to the West Coast. So I source some local friends, or it might just be me at home with the dogs, and that's fine. That's been several years. It's an excuse to make a lot of really delicious pumpkin pie and not have to share it.
Very nice. Yeah. My brother and I, like quite some time ago, my brother's a vegan. And so
Mhm.
he and we've overlapped cities at various points in our adult lives. And so we had started a brother sister tradition of having a vegan Thanksgiving, and that's sustained. And so that's really nice. We kind of divide families typically, like my parents and my sister and my nephews are the omnivore Thanksgiving. And then I join my brother and his girlfriend and sometimes some vegan friends. So it's funny how those things kind of work themselves out. But I found myself just recently chatting with some people who are vegan who were talking about hosting other people for the holidays and preparing meat for them, preparing non-vegan foods for them because they felt it was the right thing to do.
Oh, no.
to make people happy. They didn't want anyone to feel unsatisfied, and why should they push their way of eating on anybody else? And even in that circumstance, even though these people I was talking to were themselves ethical vegans, I just had a really hard time allowing that comment to pass. I mean, it's funny. I don't know if you've experienced this, but the longer I'm vegan, the more nuance and the more layers of judgment that can arise.
Sure.
Even the people who are vegan may not be, vegan enough
Vegan
or
enough.
activist enough or quite as animal focused enough. It's hilarious the amount of judgment I can jump to in my head, and like you've alluded to with yourself, I too have been all over the map in terms of like where I've been, from vegetarian
There's
to
some
vegan to
literature. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I know intellectually I'm no one to judge, but yeah, how do you what do you think of that? What do you think of that perspective of, oh, I don't want people to feel unsatisfied. I want to be a good hostess. So I'm going to prepare these foods for them as well as vegan dishes so people can have what they want.
Right. I I suppose I can understand how someone would come to that perspective. It is not one that I have ever had at any point in my vegan journey, and I do feel, I don't know if that I feel judgmental about it. I just feel baffled by it. I just am like, how can you call yourself an ethical vegan and feel like that's a reasonable thing to do? It's analogous to my dog who's with me today, Princess, who, have you met Princess? I don't think you have met Princess. She was at the
No.
first True to Life, but she didn't come to subsequent
Oh,
ones. So
okay.
some of the True to Life people met her. World's most perfect dog, obviously. And she's
Apart from
having,
Daisy.
yeah, Daisy's. But they should play date for Princess and Daisy for sure in the future. But chink in the armor of her perfection is that she's very sensitive to something. Something is giving her sort of allergic reactions. So she will have these kind of flare ups of where her paws are really itchy and her belly gets really red, and it's almost like a yeast overgrowth kind of thing. And it's probably related to her diet. And there's really only like 2 or 3 brands of mainstream vegan kibble out there for dogs, and I've got her on the cheapest one. And so I'm going to go one notch up and experiment with giving her the slightly more expensive one. But there are lots of people out there who faced with this issue, if they did some kind of elimination diet for their dog, they'd get to a point where even though they're vegan, they're cooking chicken for their dog, they're making, putting eggs in and salmon and all kinds of things. I've known vegans who have done this.
Yeah, same
I've
here.
I've known vegans who have fed their cat. Cats are obligate carnivores. Is one of the reasons I don't have cats, even though there are supplemented vegan cat foods.
And my cat Sammy was a healthy vegan for a long
Yeah,
time. So,
yeah. Well, one of my whole cat thing is more complex, where I feel like it's this is just my personal feeling about it. I feel it is limiting their life experience to keep them as indoor cats. But I also
oh,
feel
100%. I
that
think that's true of dogs as well.
it's totally true of dogs. I think with cats, it hampers their happiness more to have to
Yeah.
sit inside and stare out the window at all the things they want to hunt.
Yeah.
And so I'm just not going to let a cat roam free outside for so many different reasons, because I don't want the incredible numbers of birds being killed and everything, and also it's dangerous for the cat, and it's just all kinds of problems. So I don't want, all these reasons are why I don't have cats. But for Princess, I just really cannot see coming to a point where, even if it's for her well-being, if she really were better off on a rice and chicken diet, I am not going to be preparing chicken for this dog. Like, there may be a threshold at which I could see myself maybe buying chicken for her, but even that is, it's tough to imagine getting to that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
And certainly I would never buy it and prepare it and like do that. It's not, my
Yeah.
kitchen is totally animal product free. So, because I only mention that gray area because if we're out and about and someone at the vet wants to give her a non-vegan treat, I will let them do that. That's not, I'm not going to police what strangers or friends want to feed my dogs all the time. And that's another line where some vegans really would. Some vegans would have a really hard some vegans have a problem with the fact I have companion animals at all. They see that as
Yeah.
exploitative. So, I mean, I remember in my journey from vegetarianism to veganism feeling really oppressed by all of this and feeling really like that judgment that you're talking about, detecting it from my vegan friends and feeling like,
Mm.
well, why would I want to be part of your club when you're so judgy and you're so harsh
Mm.
about everything? And frankly, some of this is kind of ridiculous. Like you're telling me that I can't do XYZ and I can't feed my
Mm.
dog an egg on their food. Like what the heck? So I think it really is, the approaches to this are multi-splendored and everyone's on their own path. That path is likely to change over the course of your lifetime, either things that maybe you don't tolerate now that you did early on, or maybe vice versa. I know I have a lot less flexibility on things that I used to go to restaurants and not care too much if there might be a little something in the dressing, or particularly if I was traveling. And now I'm much more, I police that a lot more. I had more of
Mhm.
a freegan sensibility in the early days where it was like, well, if I didn't seek it out, but there's a little bit of milk or egg and a baked good at a coffee shop, what's the harm? And I really just don't have that latitude anymore. So I think you just have to realize people evolve. People, you don't want to freeze people in time, because then they're sort of oppressed and imprisoned by what it is that you expect of them, and the judgment that accompanies that. So, just let people take their path and plant the seeds wherever you can and bring delicious sides to any omnivorous gathering you're forced to attend and be the example. And then, just try to spend your time with people who share those values, the bulk of your time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, I share your views in many respects, of course, as you know. Yeah, I mean the concept of preparing non-vegan foods for somebody else is hard for me to fathom now, but I know at a certain point, especially in my vegetarian days, I probably would have been willing to do that. I
Sure.
I know there were points, especially in my early, like really uneducated vegetarian, maybe even early vegan days. There was a period of time, and it's embarrassing to talk about, but you're you're schooled in evolutionary psychology. You know about signaling and ego, and I wasn't even aware I was doing this at the time, but there was a period like early on where I thought of my vegetarianism as kind of a fun fact about myself. Like, oh, this is one of my
Mm,
cute little quirks. Like, I'm vegetarian. And I was committed to it morally, even though I was completely uninformed, because I now believe that being a non-vegan vegetarian is pretty useless
yeah.
in terms of contributing anything positive to animals. And yeah, domesticated animals, I completely agree about cats. Although I will say that if and when I do adopt another cat, he or she will definitely get to go outside. He'll
Mhm.
be, despite all the risks and despite all the other reasons. Yeah, the bird issue,
They
that's
kill
a
so
little.
many birds. I mean, just,
Do they really kill a
thousands
lot
of
of
birds a
them?
year, like true cats that really do live outdoors year round, like they, or that are free to go outside whenever they want. I forget what the number is, but it's, in the high hundreds or thousands of small animals a
Wow,
year.
okay,
They,
so it's a lot. I
they,
didn't realize that. Yeah, and
they
then seeing the cats with, like, a little bell on them or something, that seems cruel too, because
yeah.
you can tell it just takes the fun out of so much of their
And
existence.
I think it actually does not have a harm reducing effect. I think they're
Really
able to kill just as many other animals. Yeah.
interesting,
Yeah,
interesting.
it really is this kind of, it confronts you with that question of, yeah, you'd spend thousands of dollars at the vet to save your domestic animal, but this domestic animal puts all of these wild animals in at harm that they would otherwise not be. And so where are your vegan values really? Why aren't they
Yeah,
with the wild
yeah,
animals? So Yeah, these are very complicated questions.
These
And
are very complicated questions. I think the good news is, and it's good to even remind ourselves sometimes, is that these are all kind of the luxury philosophical questions.
mm,
That the vast, vast amount of harm being done to animals is within our, so-called food system. So by eating
definitely.
vegan, the other stuff can be debated, the other stuff can be pondered, and people can come to different conclusions. But as long as we're eating vegan, that's like a huge, huge start. But yeah, I read this book. Have you heard of this novel called The Vegan?
Just the vegan? No, I don't think
Just
so.
The Vegan.
Yeah.
Yeah, I even have it. This is not particularly an endorsement of it, but it's
Oh.
called The Vegan. I was curious. I read it out of curiosity. A friend of mine mentioned it to me, a vegan friend, and she said maybe this author is on the same page as you about normalizing veganism through the arts. And,
Mm,
immediately I was like, well, normalizing veganism through the arts doesn't entail calling a book The Vegan. That's not normalizing veganism. That's calling attention to it as something kind of out there and weird. So I read the book, and it's definitely not, I'm not going to spoil it, do a spoiler in terms of the plot, but it's definitely not what I would consider a vegan book. But one
mm,
of the interesting things in the book was they do talk about dogs. They make some just passing references to dogs, and just kind of how boring their lives are, how little external stimulation they get, how they're yelled at and reprimanded anytime they get excited to see a member of their own species. And, they're chained to this leash all the time, even when they do get to go outside. I mean, it really, even just those limited references. I mean, it's not like these weren't things I hadn't thought about. It's not like these were things I hadn't thought about ever before. But I guess because I do often have dogs staying with me, including my stepdog Daisy. Yeah, it really did just like bring home to me just what a marginalized existence these dogs have, how this is surely not how they were meant to live. And it's so depressing because there's only so much we can do. If we do have dogs in our lives, sure, we'd love to give them the world, but realistically, we can't. In most cases, they need to be inside most of the time. We can't take them out 24/7. We can't let them run free. So it's like we do what we can, but it's just so sad. It's almost heartbreaking, when you come home and the dogs are so happy to see you, which is sweet, but how much of it is because they're just so freaking bored, that just
yeah.
the stimulation. I mean, you tell me this, you live with dogs. You spend more time around dogs than I do. So what's your take on their situation, their domestication? Like how happy or how rich do you think the lives are for most just regular average dogs?
I wish I believed it was happier and richer than I think it really is. I read a book years ago and I don't remember which one it was because when I first got Motown, who's my soul dog who just passed last year, I read a lot of books around that time around dog behavior and just all sorts of interesting dog stuff. But one of the books, this woman did an experiment where she had a lot of property. She had a couple hundred acres and she had multiple dogs. And she wanted to see what the dogs would do if they really were able to have free will and make decisions for themselves and come home and get some food but do whatever they wanted the rest of the time. And what she wound up discovering is that as time passed, the dogs wanted to spend less and less time with her. She really was just a peripheral figure in their existence, and they preferred to keep their own company and to have adventures and to roam further and further. I think she had like trackers on them to see where they went and what they were up to, and yeah, they wanted to go explore and hunt and roam and be dogs and do dog stuff. And I really struggle with this. Kind of ties into some of the things that I wrote in my book that I published this summer, the Truth Be Told book, where I talk about how sometimes our biggest addictions are emotional addictions and interpersonal addictions, and the ways in which, I mean, you're talking about how we have these dogs and we just can't let them do these things. We have to keep them inside. We have to do this. And why do we have to do that? What are we afraid will happen? Well, we're afraid of harm coming to the dog, right? Primarily, we're afraid of what we will experience if harm comes to that dog. We're in some sense, and I'm speaking really, I know people will take issue with some of this, and you're just going to let your dog run around and get hit by a car because you don't want to have an emotional addiction. But at the level of what is happening emotionally, I think a lot of it is pretty addictive. I think we are pretty hooked into this feeling of having something that is obligated to care about us, to give us affection, and we're obligated to a sense of keeping that creature safe from harm, because if it were to encounter harm, there's a whole cascade of bad feelings that we don't want to experience as a result of that. So, I mean, I've pondered as I lost my two dogs last year, who were, I mean, I really thought of them as children. They were with me for so much of my formative years through pre-sobriety, and, just really served in my life this role. And I've talked about this before, where they were proxies for a richer life that I didn't need to have because I had these dogs. I had my relationships with my dogs. I had this sort of like, especially when you have big dogs, they take up a lot of physical space. You're able to have some sort of semblance of this sense of emotional and physical intimacy by having these big warm creatures sitting next to you on the couch. And I think it short circuits the largeness of the life that we would otherwise live, because we're sort of hooked into getting it in the form of methadone from this emotional relationship with these dogs. And we sort of talk ourselves into this idea that this is what's best for everyone, and I just love them so much and they love me so much and everything. And I do love dogs. I mean, I am one of those people who, like you see in the memes, where I'm sniffing their paws and I just love how stinky they are, and I love everything about them. They're just, I really feel dogs are part of my genome. But the more I think about it and the more I examine my own, what am I getting out of this relationship, and in what ways am I willing to constrain this creature's autonomy in order to serve my sense of safety, in order to avoid my fears, in order to get some sort of emotional feedback that I'm seeking and maybe I'm not able to get elsewhere. It starts to get a little dicey when you start to look at everything from all of those angles. So it's kind of left me in this position where I always just assumed I would have dogs, that I would adopt dogs, that I would rescue dogs. That's a whole other conversation. This, I'm the rescuer. I'm this good person who's
Right.
in this position, who otherwise this poor dog, what kind of condition would they be in? And for the first time, I am starting to understand that critique that some vegans will have, where companion animals, this is not really a vegan thing to do. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that I share that position, but I understand it better than I used to.
Yeah. Yeah. Same here. I remember hearing that early on in my vegan days, that PETA says you shouldn't even have pets. Everybody loves to say PETA says this. I have a wonderful coaching client who's pondering this issue of consent in all areas of our lives. And just even on the most minuscule levels, these domesticated animals have very little consent in many ways, even just the act of like being put on a leash and all of these things that we would never do to a human child. I remember one time seeing, being at Disney World or something like that, and seeing parents who did have a little toddler on a leash, and my parents being horrified. That's awful. Like, that's horrible. Well, why is it so much more horrible than, doing it to an animal? And then also, like with dogs, just the dogs that I've had in my households, dog sitting, they're so sweet. Like their seeming dependence is so sweet and so endearing in many ways. You know, like some of them just want to be just by your side and just close to you at all moments, you know, even if I'm just going to the bathroom in the middle of the night. And it's sweet, but in other moments it just really strikes me as like, yeah, kind of sweet, but like wrong. Like this is
Right.
not a creature who's built to be dependent in this way. It doesn't add up. There's something that went awry somewhere in, you
Well,
know,
we've
one of these
selected
steps.
for we interfered. We've bred
We
this into
interfered.
them in
Yeah.
order
Yeah.
to satisfy our own emotional desires. Like we wanted just like we would judge if someone said, "Oh, I really want to have children, so there's someone who's obligated to give me unconditional love." We judge that.
Yeah.
We have a
Yeah.
reaction to someone who wants to be a parent of children for that reason, even though that is absolutely a reason that a lot of people want to have children. They wouldn't say it out loud. And if someone does say it out loud, we're sort of like, whoa, that's, a little messed up. I don't know about that. But we selected these particular characteristics because we found them pleasing. We found them, and in the process, we created this really helpless species that cannot really survive without us. And in some ways, we've done this with domestic livestock as well. And so, what is our ethical obligation here at this point, now that we've created this system? We've created all kinds of incentives for it to perpetuate itself. We have far too many of these animals and can have loving homes. What even is a loving home for them? And yeah, as you say, if we just do the most superficial of thought experiments, would I want this for myself? Would I want a stranger who knew what was best for me and gave me a bowl of exactly the same food every day and like forced me to stay in the same four walls? Like, even as a human, fairly social and non nomadic, and like I don't have the nervous system that a dog has with the same sort of need to seek the same kind of stimulation. But even the level of stimulation that I would want to seek would be completely in conflict with even a very well-meaning owner. Like that is something I think most of us would not want to sign ourselves or anyone that we cared about up for. And yet we do this to our domestic pets without a second thought. And we pat ourselves on the back for
Yeah.
doing something virtuous. And so it's a thorny issue.
It's really thorny. Yeah, it's one that's just really, ever since reading this book again, not exactly a pro vegan book by any stretch, but some of the passages about dogs was really stayed with me. And I don't know that there's any reconciling them, because it's certainly not good for all of these dogs and cats to be in shelters and cages or euthanized,
Right.
so in that respect, yes, it is a massive upgrade to get to live inside four walls with a human who will put some food in front of them twice a day. But it's just such a depressing existence when you really think about it. And I just, see these dogs who come and stay with me, and I just feel so horribly guilty, even when they're just, lying around hanging out, because they seem content. They seem okay, but how
Yeah,
much of that
sure.
is just
Sure.
because they're just good natured and just going to make the best of any given situation, no matter how unsatisfying?
Yeah, they haven't been given, you seem good natured in your day-to-day life because you haven't had the full liberty to explore your nature either.
Right,
And so
right,
we,
right.
we
There's
do
that
sort of
too.
become accustomed to our circumstances. There's something here that I've thought about before, where, and I have fallen into this myself, where I've almost been compulsively, um, I've felt this sort of deep reassurance by looking at the dogs sleeping and comfortable, and it's sort of this, oh, you're so safe and it's warm and cozy and safe and you're loved, and I've even like said that, not for years, but I remember when I originally had Motown, I would just hug him and say, you're safe and loved. And it was like this thing that I desperately needed to communicate to him as if he was an entity who could understand that, when really how much of that is there's some projection going on here, right? Like
Yeah.
there's some sort of
Yeah.
way in which I am not feeling safe and warm and loved, and
Mm.
I'm able to see it in these animals and to get some kind of proxy for that, and
Mm.
to allow that to avoid other things in my life. I think that is a big part, especially of women who have domestic pets and who are, like making their pets their children. And again, if we saw them doing this with children, and behaving in these ways, we'd be pretty judgy about it. We'd be like, "Oh, you're such a helicopter mom," or "You're smothering your child," or these other kinds of things. And there are evolutionary reasons that we find it satisfying to see this creature sleeping peacefully as well. That is conveying some sort of sense of safety. If the dog is sleeping peacefully, it means we're not under attack by the barbarians. But there's a lot going on there that is maybe not quite so laudable. So
Yeah, it's so interesting. And just like with going vegan itself, once you become aware of these things, it just becomes, once you see them, you can't unsee them.
right,
And in
right,
many cases, there are no easy answers, and possibly no answers at all, really.
yeah.
Um,
And it's such a continuum. It's like
yeah,
we can sit here and look at animals as entertainment somewhere like SeaWorld and find that totally appalling and want to shut it down. But then we are using our animals for emotional payoff as well. So on that same
yeah.
continuum, obviously in a very different way, but there's still some sort of emotional exploitation that's happening there.
Well, for that matter, we're often using other humans for the
Yes,
same
we are.
purposes.
Yes, we are.
So I don't know that that's that much different. But on a related subject, yeah, the SeaWorld thing reminded me. Did you did you come across that doc? I think it was a docu-series, or maybe it was. I heard an interview on NPR, but I think it was a docu-series somewhere else. But it was about the whale who played Willie in Free Willy.
Hmm.
Did you hear about that?
It sounds familiar, but I don't think I saw it.
So, I want to say his name is, I'm going to get it wrong, Heiko or Takeo.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Sounds right.
and he was living in an aquarium in Mexico, and pretty horrific conditions. But I just heard, I was driving somewhere and heard a rebroadcast of the initial series, and I think it was a 6-part docu-series about the whale who is known to the world as Willie, but the actual
Hmm.
whale was I think it was Takeo, although I may be getting that wrong. But it was so interesting because in this episode, for one, they were interviewing the trainers at this little ramshackle aquarium place. It wasn't even an aquarium. It was just like a marine amusement park kind of thing in Mexico, where he lived in the equivalent of a swimming pool, and kind of just not great conditions. But they talked to one of the trainers, who just were very convincing in terms of expressing how much they loved this whale and how much he loved them. And they played with him and they showered him with affection. And no, they weren't claiming that his circumstances were ideal, but he knew he was loved, and he loved showering them with affection as well, and swimming with them and getting this affection and attention. And it was just, and they were describing how after the movie Free Willy came out, the producers, when they were making a sequel to Free Willy, they had gotten such an activist outpouring, and also just an outcry from kids watching the movie, who wanted
Hmm.
the whale who had played Willie to, like Willie, get to be freed and get to be like re like rehabited into the, not, into the ocean, into the environment. But of course, to make this happen, because I think this whale had been living there since he was like 2 years old. It's like he had essentially
Mm.
grown up there. He'd been taken from his pod when he was an infant. And so he was going to need like a lot of training, a lot of new skills. And it was questionable as to whether he'd ever be able to be fit for the wild. But the first step was to take him to a much bigger tank where he could be taught some of the skills he would need. But transporting him from Mexico to, I believe it was somewhere in Oregon or maybe Washington State, he was
Mm.
going to need to be flown. And that obviously
Mm.
is not easy to transport a massive marine animal. They were going to need to fly him by either plane or helicopter and get him into a sling. And they were describing the process of, they had to train him to be willing to get into the sling and learn to,
Mm.
because he was going to have to spend hours in it on this plane ride. And so they trained him and they taught him and they used all their loving techniques to do it. But then when the time came for him to actually do it, he sensed something was up and he wouldn't move. He wouldn't do it. And so they got a giant fishing net and forced him into this land. Even just listening to this one episode, yeah, it was just bringing me to tears. And I don't know the I don't know the course of events. Probably some people listening will know more about it than I do, just from following, the news about this whale who was a public figure. I don't know what happened to him, but it's just so heart-wrenching. I mean, we all know that life doesn't always have a happy ending for a lot of people, but I think there's still some part of me that assumes that, okay, it may be hard now, but like things will work out in the end. And yet for a lot of humans, it never does. And for a lot of non-humans, it never does. They never have existences that any of us could reasonably deem satisfactory. And yet we have to somehow, like put one foot in front of the other and like live life. So yeah,
Yeah.
just existential questions come up really, really quickly
There's
with
so
all of
many
these things.
dilemmas, and they all kind of
Yeah.
come back to this, like, this hubris that we know what is best for this animal, that we, even moving it to the bigger enclosure, we're doing this for its own good. But the sort of
Yeah.
the ends justify the means here. Yes, you're going to have this
Yeah.
horrible, stressful experience, and we have to do all this training, and it's going to be more stressful than we anticipated, but it's for your own good, and trust us as the superior species. We know
Yeah.
that, like, what are we, what's that premised upon? It's just, and a lot of this, as we've talked about before, is this kind of luxury philosophy where we can have these debates, but in the real world, you do have to make these kinds of decisions. You have to do the best that you know how by these animals that, from what we can tell, but do need our assistance or do benefit from our superior guidance, or however we want to frame it. But there's so many things like this. There's research being done into immunizing urban rats so they can't reproduce and have as many babies, because that will have a better end result. If you reduce the population of urban rats, there will be less suffering overall for the rats that do exist. And so this all seems very reasonable at first blush, but what do we actually know about what we're doing here as far as playing God in this way? And even at the level of, your own domestic pet, people routinely take their pets in and put them under anesthesia for clipping their nails or for brushing their teeth. And we don't really know what's going on even with that altered state of consciousness, even for humans, let alone another animal, and what kind of actual experience that is at the level of consciousness that we don't even understand. But we're doing it for their own good, because they'll have a better life experience if we get that plaque off of their teeth and they don't have gum disease when they get older. So there's so many things where we intrude and we insert ourselves for their own good. And, obviously this happens with other humans as well, but it's without reflection, we're very prone to make terrible mistakes. And So at the very least, we need more reflection on these questions, even though in the real world, we still have to do things. We still have to make these decisions.
Yeah. It can be so confusing. But I remember when they wanted to do that for my cat Sammy, put him under general anesthesia to have his teeth cleaned. I mean, so to me, that just didn't add up. I mean, on its face, it seems preposterous. So,
Yeah, no,
we never did it.
I've never been willing to do that either. And, even trying to brush teeth in full consciousness is quite an ordeal. And so, yeah, I'm not going to do something that I know the animal does not want done by putting
Right.
them into a place where they're utterly unable to consent. Like, oh, you're not going to consent in your waking life. I'm going to force you to consent. Like, this just does not check out ethically for me. But Motown had terrible teeth and gum problems as he got older, and I think it did contribute to suffering. And so, what is the correct thing to do? It's just, yeah, we obviously we don't have any answers in today's episode of the Posse, but they're worth asking.
Yeah, well, often we don't even have necessarily the best answers for ourselves, so let alone another human being.
Yeah.
It's there's a lot to unpack for sure. I'm curious, do you think your dogs could survive in the wild? Like if they were on their own, do you think they could manage?
Depends which dog we're talking about. of the three, some are scrappier than others, but like Lucy, who's very scrappy, she's a Chiweenie, a little Chihuahua Dachshund mix. She's very scrappy, she's very resourceful, but she's itty bitty and could very easily get picked off by a bird of prey. This happens all the time. I have to watch her when she's in the yard if there's somebody circling above. Peaches would be utterly helpless. Peaches is just completely barely is able to survive in very benign domestic circumstances. And she's a case that was subjected to a lot of abuse early in life. Not even sure quite what happened to her, but may have had nourishment issues, may have had brain damage issues, but she absolutely could not survive in the wild. Princess, maybe it would depend a lot on luck and what she encountered along the way, but she certainly has the capacity to be a scrappy little street dog. But yeah, I don't think any of them would make it for very long.
I tend to think Daisy could, but we'll never know. And that's a theoretical question, but I tend to think she could.
Yeah.
But,
She seems to have, her wits about her. As Princess does, but there's a lot of, I've seen bears in my neighborhood, I've seen certainly lots of foxes and coyotes, and these can gang up on a dog, and the dog's in real trouble very quickly. So plus, to find enough food and enough water and exposure and everything else, it's not easy out there.
Right. Well, yeah, just leaving. I'd love to leave people with some helpful takeaways apart from our philosophizing, because I can definitely just go deep and existential at the drop of the hat, and you're fabulous for being willing to go there with me. And I love that about
habitat.
Talking to you.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, do you have any particular tips or suggestions for people going into the holiday season around veganism and or activism?
I think just, find people that you can either, if you can't be with them for the actual event, that you can connect with afterwards and remind yourself of what you're doing and why you're doing it, especially if you're a relatively new vegan and feeling a little shaky and a little like it's going to be a problem to be pushed around and challenged by people. I think it is important to, my first couple of vegan years, there used to be a podcast called Vegan Freak, which some old school vegans might remember.
Yeah.
And I think my first Thanksgiving back home as a vegan, I was just, mainlining Vegan Freak. I was just listening to every episode because I felt like here's a community that understands. These are
Mm.
people. It's important to, as Dr. Lyle calls it, you're computer checking. You're computer checking that you're not crazy. You're not all alone in the world. That other people see this the way you see it. You share. There are people out there with whom you share values. And so if you find yourself on an island in some hostile environment where everyone's talking about how great all of these animal products are, I think having some touchstone, virtual or not, in the world that you can connect with in your own time, just to remind yourself why you're doing this and what it's all about. That's probably the number one piece of advice. And the other is our old trick from evolutionary psychology, which is called mathematize the misery. Just realize it's not forever. It's just a couple of days out of the year. If you are stuck in some hostile family environment, this is a discrete amount of time that you have to tolerate this situation, and pretty soon you will be back to normal life. And so, just like a prisoner notching off on the wall the days, you can check off boxes for every hour that goes by. You can calculate how many hours you really have to be there, and even if you're there for a long weekend, you can go visit your old friends from high school. You can get out and do things. You can go hiking. You don't have to be at home with people confronting you about these questions and being pushy the whole time. That's probably limited to just the hours of the actual meals. So I think
Yeah.
a combination of just managing the environment as best as you can and staying in touch with these, the higher purpose and goals that brought you to this lifestyle to begin with.
Yeah. And it's funny because thinking about Thanksgiving and thinking about turkeys, that episode that I mentioned, that NPR broadcast that I was listening to that talked about this orca, this killer whale, and his life and his internal experience insofar as they could glean, and just just the poignancy of everything about him and his life. So they segued from that to talking to the farmer who is responsible for raising the 22 turkeys, two of whom will get to be pardoned by the president. The other 20 of whom will be killed for, as meals for, and it was just hilarious to me. I mean, hilarious, and also just, I've been vegan too long to be surprised by this, this cognitive dissonance any longer, but it nevertheless fails, never fails to astound me, just that they could segue from this poignant story of this living being to just this, and you could tell just by the tone and the music in this next story that they considered it kind of a fun fluff piece,
Yeah.
like about this turkey who's raising these 20 birds. And it's an honor for him. And they were talking about, like, well, how do you select the two that get to be pardoned? And just
That's amazing. I
it's
mean,
yeah.
the whole kind of idea around pardoning turkeys at all is it's such like an ancient mythological weird ritual where we're like atoning for what we recognize is this horrible sin that all of factory farming and all of our dependence on animal agriculture and animal food is like reduced down to the presidential turkey pardon, and by that we are washed free of all of this sin. It has this very like mythological gravitas to it. It's kind of like the opposite of a stoning. We've selected these turkeys to represent the fact that we can't possibly think of ourselves as evil because we took pity and allowed these to go free. So it's a very obviously very hypocritical culture, and just incapable of deep reflection on how and why it is so hypocritical. And I can just hear that NPR segue in my head, the sort of, and now for back to our regular programming
Right.
about animal slaughter and abuse, ha ha ha.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, to me, it's also just very telling about what the mainstream considers our baseline moral
Right.
obligation to non-human animals, and clearly it considers it to be absolutely zero, so that anything that we do, that's remotely compassionate or empathetic, just puts us in the black, morally speaking. Like we've done, by doing anything, by choosing not to kill and torture two of these birds, we are just, like
Or by
next in line for
doing,
sainthood. Yeah.
yeah, or some bullshit like happy cows. We had, I'm a good person because my cow, I have a little index card that gives me information about where it was raised and all of the grass that it ate, instead of it wasn't in some terrible feedlot somewhere. Or my eggs are happy eggs from happy chickens that were free range. It's just the the readiness to partake in these delusions in order to not bear the responsibility of the true evil with which we are totally complicit is pretty impressive. And that's human nature, in a nutshell. So,
Yeah, yeah. Well, one suggestion that I'll offer too to people is I love the idea of mathematizing, and I do find that counting, whether it's counting, negative things or counting positive things, like it does bring a little bit of detachment and a
yeah.
little bit of relief, because at least it's quantified, it's finite. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that one thing that I found interesting to do is when I'm at an omnivore event, which, like you, I don't go to tons of them by choice, but when I am there, just to notice all of the dishes that are kind of baseline plant-based. Maybe in that particular recipe there's an animal product, but just how they're predominantly plant-based and how easily they could be veganized, and just noticing those, and just like tallying the results, like, okay, of all of these dishes being served, the large majority are at their base, plant derived, and
Mm-hmm.
plants are at their essence, and that can be heartening. And then I also think it can be fun to count the incidence of cognitive dissonance, or you know just these ridiculous moments, because I do think that vegan venting is very helpful, and it
Mm-hmm.
just, even if you can just document these little annoyances, just planning to tell a vegan friend or confidant later on, as a fun story that you both totally get. Like, one, I had such an incident, recently from my mom's, and I don't think my wonderful family will be listening to this episode, so I'm not too worried about them taking offense, or being hurt by it. But basically, it was my mom's 80th birthday, and so my non-vegan sister was in charge of getting the cake. I had volunteered to be in charge of the cake, and I, of course, would have, gotten a very fancy, delicious vegan cake.
Mm-hmm.
Easy peasy, not hard. But my sister beat me to volunteering for cake duties. I did mention to her beforehand, hey, how about making it a vegan cake? How about going for a vegan cake? Never actually spoke with her about it or discussed it. So I wasn't counting on it happening or expecting it to happen, but I did kind of wonder if maybe she would go that route. Well, of course, what she did was she got a regular cake. And then, because she's so thoughtful and considerate and generous, she also ordered 3 vegan cupcakes
Ah,
for me and my brother and my brother's girlfriend, the 3 vegans, because who other than the ethical vegans would be interested in eating vegan baked goods,
right.
because
Right.
nobody else would be like, and
Yeah.
why impose vegan baked goods
Because
on?
they're just so terrible and
They're just
inedible.
so disgusting. Yeah. So it just was,
That,
and
yeah.
it just was funny. And then, of course, it was it was a beautiful cake, it was absolutely gorgeous. But of course, people, and then it was really funny too, because this is more vegan venting, free vegan venting. The restaurant where the party was being held, we told them that there was going to be a birthday cake being served, but I guess as part of the standard dinner menu, they also provided dessert. So in addition to this birthday cake, which was more than enough for everybody. They also served cheesecake for everybody. So in addition to all the cake, everybody got cheesecake, non-vegan cheesecake, of course. And then partly because of the cheesecake and also partly because of how large the cake was, there was a ton of cake left
Of
over.
course. Yeah.
All be thrown away. And it reminds me, I had a friend who talked about a going away party that they'd held for her at her office where she'd worked for a long time. And because they knew she was vegan, and same thing at her going away party, they ordered a cake for everybody. And it was not vegan, but they got a cupcake, vegan cupcake for her, just for her.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Which
Like,
is, yeah. And
yeah.
it just shows, I mean, I get it on some levels. When you're not vegan, you just don't understand the shift in perspective, but it just clearly never even crossed their minds that the last thing she would want at a party in her honor was for products to be served that had harmed animals.
It's like the
Yeah.
expectation that an alcoholic is going to serve alcohol at their wedding just to keep the guests happy, or that
But
you're going
even that is like that's outside, like, yes, but like it also is outside the ethical realm too. So like the
It is,
analogy
but
isn't
if
quite.
it's your event and it's
Yeah.
you're the one who's being celebrated, and
Yeah.
like you should be able to set the terms of
Yeah.
what the food is, and if it's something that you wouldn't eat or you wouldn't drink or that is harmful to you or that causes you distress, like let's not have it there. But
Yeah.
I think there is this idea that vegan substitutes are so inferior that it really has not caught up, which was true for a long time. I mean, if you wanted to go find a vegan cake, a commercial vegan cake, when I first went vegan, you were not going to have a lot of luck finding something particularly delicious. You could make something, you could find a recipe and make something that would be really similar to what you would make now, but you kind of had to know where to look, and it was a little bit of a protected in-group. But now there's
Well,
just really no excuse,
there's no excuse. And also, like, I mean, I always like to just point out that there are plenty of traditional dishes that are
Oh,
inherently
totally.
vegan, like a lot of apple crumbles,
Yeah.
gingerbread cake, gingerbread cookies. Like there are a lot of foods that are just naturally vegan and
And a
that
lot of
taste.
commercial foods, a lot of favorites. A client just pointed out to
Yeah.
me the other day that the Pillsbury like croissants, the little rolls that you make which are a holiday special in a lot of
Oh
families.
yeah, the crescent rolls.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, they're
those just
vegan. Yep.
happen to be vegan because
Yep.
they're made with cheap oil instead of
Yeah.
butter. And so
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
are, I mean, John McDougall used to talk about how Thanksgiving was probably the healthiest day of the year because a lot of Thanksgiving food is just intrinsically plant-based
Right.
or leaning that direction. You have to kind of work hard to add dairy or egg to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely, but even if you're convenience minded and you're looking for a quick cupcake or you're looking for something easy that you can find in the frozen food section, I mean, there's just so many good substitutes now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
even the cheese has gotten good, and that was not true. That was definitely not true for a long time. So, but
Right.
I think culturally people have not caught up with that. They still there it's baked into the collective psyche that any alternative to meat is going to taste like a garden burger, and that's just for the hippies and the bird food to eat. So
yeah. And by the same token, if they eat a vegan cupcake that's not completely moist and delicious, the
right.
reason it's not moist and delicious is because it's vegan, because
Exactly.
they've never had a less than delectable non-vegan, cake or cookie.
Exactly. Yeah, there's very little reflection on that. So
right,
but,
like my uncle this weekend was talking about how he tried some vegan ice cream once. It was okay. It was okay, and of course, as you know, there's an array. There are like more vegan ice creams than you can even list. And yes, they range in quality, but for the most part, they're completely decadent and delicious. And for him to be saying it was okay, it was not quite as good as it's hilarious. It's hilarious and also just ridiculous.
why
But
the
that's
number
life. But
one number one piece of advice is like find your people. And even
Find
if
your
that's just in
people.
the like the
Yeah.
comment section of this video, like your people will be there, so you
Right.
can
Good
vent
point.
about your
Good point.
Thanksgiving misadventures there. You can come over to my membership site and talk about it. There are lots of places that you can go. So
Yes, yes, for
even
sure. I
even
think
if you
that's
can,
great advice. Yeah.
yeah,
And the last thing that I'll mention, which kind of still falls in the category of venting, but I guess for me, particularly around the holidays, especially the holidays like Thanksgiving, where people just really purport to be just focused on gratitude and these higher spiritual values of sharing and camaraderie and delight, to be in this space where people are so ostensibly being philanthropic and generous
right,
and open-hearted, to be completely and often willfully overlooking dead bird at the center of the table and all of the suffering. It can be doubly frustrating if you have any consciousness around those things. So yeah.
definitely, definitely, yeah. It is not an easy rite of passage if this is your first Thanksgiving or you're early in the process, or I guess even for some of us who are seasoned vegans who still partake in these omnivorous settings. Yeah, I don't think it ever gets easy to witness that kind of hypocrisy.
Yeah, yeah. Nor should it
Yeah.
necessarily. I don't think the answer is to become totally okay with all of these things. And at the same time, I think it's good. It's good for me at least to remind myself that there's hypocrisy everywhere with all kinds of issues at any moment of any day. And
Including in our
so,
own
oh
commitment.
yeah,
So, we're
yeah,
trying to do the best we can,
yeah,
but we're
yeah,
making ethical mistakes and
sure,
missteps all over the place. And some of those are not going to be apparent to us for a long time, but some of them are apparent to me now, and I still run that cost benefit and I do it anyway. And so, yeah,
yeah,
no one
yeah.
is let he who is without sin cast the first stone and all of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, right, right. So, all right. Well, on that note, we'll wrap it up. But thanks, Jen. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and wisdom and just genuine vegan spirit with us in
Definitely.
this pre-Thanksgiving, pre-Christmas, pre-holiday week.
Yeah.
And we close every episode by taking 30 seconds of silence for all of the suffering animals, human and non human, who desire, as we all do, safety, happiness, and the freedom to live out their lives without interference. So, Jen, I invite you to join me in 30 seconds of silence for the animals, and we'll conclude with the sound of the bell. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Posse. See you next time. Until then, stay strong and stay true.